For most historians, the Roman triumph was the pinnacle of a general's glory. But for the captured women, this day was a ritual of total annihilation. What happened when the doors of Rome's prisons closed behind these virgins and queens has been systematically erased from official records. You were taught they were merely slaves. The truth is much darker. They were transformed into living trophies, stripped of their humanity, and forced into a fate that made death seem like a relief. Today, we will reveal the secret of the Tullianum and what Roman generals actually did to their captives when the parade ended, a secret that Rome tried to hide for 2,000 years. Welcome to Secrets of Slavery, Segredos de la Esclavitud. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to see today is provenly worse than death. They marched her down the Via Sacra as Rome roared, banners snapping, trumpets blaring, the crowd pressing in to see the man who had conquered. She was not a faceless prop. She had a name once, family, a life that mattered to someone. By the time the general raised his laurel and the gates closed behind him, something of her had been taken in plain sight, her legal personhood, her dignity, the right to be remembered. This was a public ceremony that celebrated victory and quietly erased people. When we follow those traces, the evidence suggests that for some survivors, the ritual led to a form of life worse than death. If you want more stories official history tried to silence, subscribe and stay with us. The Roman triumph is one of the most famous pieces of ancient political theater, a procession where a victorious commander, decked in purple and laurel, paraded through Rome with his legions, his standards, the captured wealth of a conquered people, and, crucially, prisoners of war led in chains. Ancient writers dwell on the spectacle. The general rides through the city, musicians play, priests perform rites, and the Senate and people acclaim a public restoration of Roman honor. Yet the triumph did more than celebrate military prowess. It performed a political theater that consecrated the general's authority, redistributed wealth, asserted Rome's power over foreign peoples, and defined who, within the city's moral and legal world, counted as fully human. At first glance, the triumph looks like a moment of glory carved for posterity. Triumphal arches, coinage, statues, encomia. These monuments and texts have survived to tell us whose deeds were praised, but they also hide something else, the human cost that is rarely shown in marble reliefs or official chronologies. To reconstruct that hidden side, we have to read both what the sources put forward and what they leave out. We must balance the detailed descriptions of processionary spectacle with silences in law, archaeology, and epigraphy. Where evidence is absent or contested, we mark it as indefinido or attributed to a specific ancient author.
Plutarch and Livy, for example, describe the triumph as a public display of spoils, captives, and the victorious commander's honors. Livy's accounts emphasize the civic and religious dimensions, the parade through the sacred way, the halt before the temple of Jupiter, the sacrifices. Plutarch, in several lives, paints vivid scenes of the procession's pomp, noting the captives and the display of defeated rulers. These are not neutral travelogues. They were written with an eye to moral instruction and political meaning. They record spectacle, but they rarely give us the captive's viewpoint. That absence is itself a source of evidence. To humanize the story without inventing specific unverified victims, we follow one figure as a composite, Aelia, composite, a woman captured during a provincial campaign. She represents the experiences many ancient captives may have faced. Her arc is built from known categories of treatment attested in the sources and archaeological patterns. Those specific details about her life are reconstructed for narrative clarity. Labeling her composite helps us hold the line between imaginative empathy and historical caution. Aelia's capture is quiet at first, a raid on a riverside settlement, the stun of violence, the collapse of household order. Forced from familiar rooms into makeshift camps, the captured are processed, names, rights, and local statuses stripped. In some cases, men were executed, in others sold or retained. Women, children, and the elites often face different fates. According to Roman legal practice and wartime custom, many captives were destined to be slaves, sold in markets, or retained for the general's use. When a commander claimed a triumph, however, the presence of captives transformed private losses into public theater. Aelia is ordered to appear in chains. She is moved forward in the procession, the click of iron on stone, the smell of sweat and smoke, the noise of thousands of eyes. For the crowd, she is a sign of conquest. For her, the procession is the point where every trace of private life is stripped from her in front of her conqueror's city. The anatomy of the triumph, how it unfolds and how it affected those paraded, matters. Ancient descriptions give us a template: the victorious commander, the spoils, the soldiers, the standards, musicians, and captives proceed along a fixed route from the Campus Martius through the Porta Triumphalis into the Forum, ending at the Capitoline Hill. The commander wears the triumphal regalia, a purple-bordered toga, laurel crown, and, according to some accounts, a painted face that suggested consecration to Jupiter's favor. He offers sacrifice, enters the temple, and receives honors from the Senate and the people. The captives are usually counted among the spoils, visible, named as trophies in speeches and inscriptions, exhibited in reliefs and coinage in ways that reduce them to objects of conqueror glory rather than human beings with social bonds.
We have concrete visual evidence of how triumphal memory could be shaped by imperial patrons. The Arch of Titus, erected after AD 81 to commemorate Titus's conquest of Jerusalem, offers one of the clearest surviving reliefs showing the community's memory of spoils. Soldiers carrying the menorah and other temple objects up steps toward the triumphal arch. The relief emphasizes plunder and divine favor, not the suffering of those from whom the objects were taken. It tells a one-sided visual story. The conqueror's triumph is immortalized. The people on the losing side are absent, except as implied by the objects they once owned. Yet the sources and monuments do not tell the whole story. There are documentary traces, inscriptions, petitions, and odds and ends in papyri that sometimes voice resistance, private disruptions, or the afterlives of captives. A few inscriptions attest to appeals by freed or enslaved persons, and some funerary monuments preserve the names and origins of people once enslaved. But such traces are rare relative to the scale of conquest. Where those traces exist, they often appear in unexpected contexts, in small graffiti, in marginal notes, in burial anomalies. These are the crumbs that suggest alternative memories persisted beneath marble. The ritual performed in triumphs did more than humiliate. It reconfigured legal identity. Under Roman practice, prisoners of war could be enslaved and registered as property. In that legal sense, the captive's previous social and civic identity was converted into a new juridical condition: property, not person. For many, that loss of legal standing had cascading effects: loss of legal family ties, patrimony, civic rights, and the ability to make claims under local laws. Where a person is made into property by legal mechanisms, survivors face a structural annihilation of the social self. It's important to emphasize caution where the evidence is thin. The notion that every captive in every triumph was subjected to the same fate is incorrect. There was regional and chronological variation. Roman practices evolved over time, differed by campaign and commander, and were shaped by political considerations. In some triumphs, elite captives might be ritually paraded and later executed as a public assertion of power. Such episodes are described in particular ancient accounts. But whether execution was routine is indeterminate and contested among scholars. Where an ancient historian narrates an execution tied to a triumph, we must treat that as an account of a particular case rather than proof of a universal ritual. Consider the testimony of Plutarch. He describes several triumphs with captives and tableaus of defeated monarchs. His portrayals emphasize spectacle and moral lessons, sometimes noting grim destinies, but his focus remains on the victorious general's character.
Livy likewise annotates triumphs as civic and religious events that restore Rome's honor, often mentioning captives among the spoils, but not dwelling on their sufferings. Tacitus offers a more critical voice in some passages, drawing attention to the hypocrisy of imperial spectacle, but he writes decades later with particular political aims. When these ancient authors describe the procession, they give us specifics about the order of parade and highlight what mattered to Roman audiences: the general's piety, the riches returned to the temples, and the city's restored order. They rarely linger over the captive's inner life. That omission is itself meaningful. It shapes how memory was constructed. How did official narratives erase victims? There are multiple mechanisms. First, monumental selective memory. Arches, statues, and reliefs were commissioned by the victors or by the state to celebrate military success. They inscribed names and feats of generals and soldiers. They pictured captured standards in sacred objects, but they rarely included scenes that preserved captive identities beyond generic forms. Where reliefs show bound figures, they are often anonymous, tied to the conqueror's glory rather than to specific communities. Second, textual focus. Historians, poets, and panegyrists had reasons to praise victors and frame their deeds as service to the res publica. Biographies and annals reproduce elite concerns, honor, fortune, piety, so the captive story disappears in favor of moral exempla. Third, legal registration. Once a person was declared war booty or enslaved, their legal existence entered a register where their future was decided in mercantile and domestic terms, not civic memory. Fourth, demographic dispersal. Captives who were enslaved and scattered across households left fewer traces in public memory than they might have if a community had buried them with dedication. But erasure is never total. Small acts of resistance and survival slip through. A graffiti scratched in a marketplace, a burial with a name preserved in a cemetery far from home, or a petition inscribed on a shard can testify to a life that official records would erase. These traces are often fragile. Papyri rot, painted walls peel, and many inscriptions are lost. Archaeological silence is therefore not proof of absence, it is an archival problem. To say someone has been erased requires careful interrogation of the material and textual record, as well as awareness of whose stories the archives preserved. Let's return to Aelia, composite, within this framework. She walks the route, hands bound, identity reduced to a body on display. After the triumph, she is parceled out, perhaps sold, perhaps placed in household labor, perhaps retained by the state. Outcomes varied. If she is enslaved, her legal status changes radically. She can no longer legally claim family inheritance, marry with civic recognition, or hold property in a way that restores her previous social standing.
In many cases, the social means by which people recognized each other are extinguished. Names are changed, languages suppressed, and ties to a native community severed. For someone like Aelia, surviving the physical violence of war is only the first loss. The longer-term condition may be a life where previous social anchors are gone. That social death, erasure of memory, legal removal, cultural silencing, can be experienced as worse than a quick death, because it dissolves the social self and condemns someone to a life of servitude under the gaze of their conquerors.
Where particular writers narrate exceptional cruelty, that cruelty may have been exceptional, and thus illustrative of political extremes rather than of a routine practice. There are, however, specific episodes that illuminate the stakes. Ancient narratives record commanders who paraded captive kings or dignitaries in humiliating tableaux. Some accounts recount the later execution of vanquished leaders as an intensified spectacle, an attempt to dramatize the enemy's obliteration of status. For instance, in Roman accounts of certain Hellenistic conflicts, captured kings were sometimes paraded and later executed. These episodes are documented in particular narratives. They are not a statement about all triumphs. Treat each reported case as a historical datum, requiring source attribution. In the absence of universal prescriptions, why might triumphs produce such erasures? The answer lies in the political logic of spectacle. A triumph does not simply record victory, it performs political meaning in front of the Roman populace. The general must appear to have subdued enemies, restored religious balance, and redistributed spoils, thereby reaffirming the social order. The captive on display is a proof, visible confirmation that Rome's enemies were vanquished, and that the commander's power is legitimate. Once that proof has been achieved, the captive's human individuality is dispensable to the political narrative. The public ritual thus transforms a relationship of social reciprocity into a theatrical moment that ends with the captive's disposability. Monumental erasure has long-term consequences for how later generations remember the past. When a Roman general erects an arch or funds a temple to celebrate a triumph, those choices solidify a particular memory of events. The monuments emphasize glory, piety, and conquest. They do not fund mausolea for the captives, nor do they commit to recording their names. Over centuries, the monuments and the written accounts build a durable archive of winners. The losers are left to chance traces, a shard with a scratched petition, a tombstone far from the center, or an oral memory transmitted outside the official record. Archaeology occasionally pushes back against that official archive. Excavations can reveal mass burial sites, household assemblages showing exotic objects out of context, or inscriptions suggesting the presence of people from distant places. But interpretation is complex. Not every grave is a captive's grave, and not every foreign object indicates the presence of enslaved people. Archaeological silence is not a neutral floor. Bones decay, perishable writing is lost, and many minor artifacts are destroyed. The surviving record is biased toward durable and official materials. Thus, historians must triangulate, read literary sources, analyze material culture, and attend to forensic patterns that indicate disjunctions between public memory and lived experience.
Some victims left marks of discontent in the margins. There are known cases of slaves and former captives producing graffiti that mock their masters or preserve their words in palimpsest fragments. In a few funerary inscriptions, formerly enslaved persons commemorate their native origins or retain names that recall a past life. These acts of remembrance suggest that erasure was not absolute. Small acts of resistance, keeping a name, inscribing a memory, tending a burial, offer counter-memories that survive imperfectly but insistently. The interpretive claim that the triumph's consequences could be worse than death is not a rhetorical flourish to be asserted without qualification. It is an ethical and historical interpretation that binds together physical survival with social and legal annihilation. For some captives, survival meant becoming a legal object stripped of prior identity, severed from kinship ties, publicly humiliated, and condemned to a life of servitude in which autonomy and recognition were denied. Life under conditions of permanent displacement and social invisibility can resemble a living death, a continued corporeal existence with eradicated social being. That is the sense in which worse than death can be a meaningful interpretive claim. It must be framed carefully and supported by the kinds of evidence we have, accounts of public humiliation, legal norms of enslavement, and the archaeological traces of displaced lives. At the same time, the worse-than-death thesis must not excuse the physical violence endured by many captives. Execution and physical abuse were part of some campaigns and must be recognized for their immediate horror. Our comparative judgment about which harm is worse is not a weapon for moral scoring across centuries. Rather, it is a tool to highlight the depth of long-term consequences beyond the immediate act of killing. The social death produced by legal and ritual mechanisms extended across generations. Children born into slavery after a triumph rarely reclaimed family lands or civic status. Their fortunes, like those of their parents, were reshaped by a public ceremony that amplified the conqueror's glory. We should also consider how Roman elites themselves sometimes framed these practices. Triumphal narratives frequently justified the display and disposal of captives as restorative acts, restoring temple property, punishing enemies who had violated treaty, or demonstrating Rome's control over barbarians for the safety of the res publica. In elite discourse, these justifications were political necessities. In the experience of captives, they were mechanisms of dispossession. The gap between elite rhetoric and lived reality is where historians can perform corrective work, reading the monument's language against its victims and asking what the city's triumphal memories silence. Modern viewers face their own responsibilities when they encounter triumphal monuments.
Standing before a triumphal arch, it is tempting to read the reliefs and inscriptions as simple records of military skill. But the more honest historical encounter asks us to think of who is missing from the frame. Asking whose faces are absent redirects attention to the human cost embedded beneath polished stone. It demands that we treat monuments not as neutral records, but as selective choices of memory, choices that insistently privileged certain lives and erased others. A final, concrete example helps crystallize the argument. Consider a hypothetical, but historically plausible, case where a general leads a triumph after a campaign in the eastern provinces. Ancient accounts might praise the general's piety and the return of stolen temple treasures. The monument erected in Rome celebrates these aspects. Meanwhile, the local community from which captives were taken experiences depopulation, the scattering of families, and the loss of ritual specialists who maintained local cults. Over time, the major public memory in Rome associates the campaign with restored temples and the general's honor. The minor memory of those uprooted survives in fragmentary local oral traditions or in small funerary inscriptions far from the civic center. The monument's triumphant narrative triumphs in the archive. The captive's narrative is buried in silence or fragmentary texts. Recognizing this asymmetry is essential to reconstructing a fuller history. Before we close, one methodological note that is important. Where specific ritual actions, such as public renaming ceremonies, ritualized marriages to the state, or formal sacrificial killings tied to a triumph, are not attested in primary sources with clarity, we must mark them indefinitive. Some accounts in the ancient literature describe dramatic acts. In others, historians reconstruct possibilities from analogous practices. Whenever we narrate such details, we must either attribute them to a named source or flag them as scholarly reconstructions. This script is attentive to those boundaries. It relies on Plutarch, Livy, Tacitus, and the visible evidence of monuments like the Arch of Titus for the broad structure of triumphs. It tweets more specific ritual practices, especially those that would entail systematic, ritualized killing of captives, as contested and thus indefinitive, unless tied to a named ancient account. In closing, the Roman triumph is both a window and a mirror. It shows how public ritual can legitimize power and distribute wealth. It mirrors back the choices a society makes about who belongs in its civic memory. For the victors, the triumph carved their names in stone. For many captives, it erased their names, redistributed their bodies as property, and dissolved social ties that once made life meaningful.
The archives and the stones that survive to us privilege the triumphal point of view. Only careful, ethically engaged history can assemble the scattered fragments of the defeated and ask what it meant to be paraded and then forgotten. This is not a story that gives us neat closure. The silence is part of the message. The cobbles of the Via Sacra may have known the click of chains and the shuffle of feet, and the arches above may still ring with the memory of applause. But those same stones also keep a quieter trace of those who were marched through and not memorialized afterwards. To read triumphs differently, we must ask new questions of old monuments. Who is missing? Whose grief is not commemorated? What forms of legal and social annihilation follow public spectacle? If this account resonates with you, tell us in the comments which monument you would like us to read differently. Share this video with someone who cares about how history remembers and forgets the lives at the margins. Next time, we'll dig into specific inscriptions and burial evidence that hint at the dispersed lives of those who survived Roman conquest. For now, when you pass beneath a triumphal arch, listen. The city is still speaking. It's up to us to hear the voices it chose not to carve in stone.